the magnitude of the thing that we're dealing with, the magnitude of what we have to be capable of responding to if we want to be able to deal with it, is the biggest thing humanity has ever faced by a large margin. So it's as challenging as the process of becoming human at all, and maybe even bigger than that.
Jordan Hall is a tech entrepreneur, futurist, and culture hacker. His essay after the Trump election, Deep Code Situational Assessment, went viral. In it, he described models and frameworks he built up over many years. He's convinced that the game that civilization has been playing for millennia is coming to an end, and something fundamental needs to shift. This is that story.
The first thing to kind of allow yourself to accept as something that is real is the phrase that I've used is history happens. It's very odd to me, actually, that people who are perfectly capable of knowing that, for example, the Roman Empire rose and fell, it actually happened, there's no question, that occurred in reality, somehow are incapable of perceiving the notion that therefore it might happen again. So let's just accept the notion that that kind of thing happens on occasion. All right. Be open to the possibility. Okay, next. Okay, well, how? How do those kinds of things show up? Well, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, we can if you'd like, but there's certain characteristics that we can actually begin to take a look at that give us a sense of where things are. And, well, where we are is actually rather challenging. Now, we're in a situation which is definitely not awesome, and probably is quite bad. Okay, well, how bad? How big an order of magnitude trouble are we looking at? Well, let's just take a couple of examples to kind of gauge the order of magnitude. Let's just start with one. Everybody's involved, the whole world. Every single human being on the planet is involved in this story. That has never happened before. Before, right now, anytime any trouble has emerged, it's been a tiny, tiny fraction of the human family. The biggest collapse of all time, the Bronze Age collapse, happened right there, and it hit, 15%. Most of the cities, but 15% of the people. Now everybody's involved. So if anything goes sideways that is vaguely of the order of magnitude of something of that kind, it's going to be a lot bigger. Like a lot bigger. Because these things reinforce each other. You may notice that when things go south, people become less good at dealing with each other gently, which makes it worse. Let's try another one. We have nukes. Lots of us have nukes, and we're getting better at making nukes, so more of us are going to have nukes. And we don't just have nukes, we also have CRISPR, which means that people can start making genetic weapons that are nuke-like in capacity. And over time, not too long from now, we're also going to have micro drones that can target, assassinate pretty much anybody unconsciously. Fill in the blank, which is to say that up until now, no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't really kill that many of us. We tried really hard. We had guns and bullets and gas, and we still didn't kill that many of us. If you take a look at the human population, even the Black Plague is like a little divot. Now, we can in fact kill everybody, or at least mostly everybody. Okay, next. Technological change. I don't know if you've seen the charts that show the pace of technological change, but if you look at a graph that goes like this, and you're here, things are different than they were when you were here. And the 1940s was like here in terms of the pace of change that was going on. The degree to which our actuation capacity, our capacity to do things in the world is accelerating is really not comprehensible to anyone. I wrote an essay called The Generation Omega where I talked about if the amount of change is continuing to move at the current pace, then the capacity of the people who are in the current generation, I think it's like 30 years from now, will be 1 million times more than now. And to kind of get a sense of that, that's like going from inventing language to the computer in a single generation. Right? And of course, we already have computers, so what's that look like? That's big. Right? Let me think. There's like 3 or 4 more. Oh, sorry, climate. We've got the whole world. Every single one of our activities has a characteristic that it generates an externality that is not well processed by the complex environment. When we're relatively lightweight, there's not many of us and we're not engaging in a lot of those activities, the complex environment can still process it. Sometimes. Heavy metals, not so much. Well, there's a lot of us, and we have increasingly intensive activities. So I'm not really talking about climate change, which is kind of been scary, but it's like this big on the scale. I'm talking about comprehensive disruption of the entire complex web of the ecosystem across every single bind. I'm talking about concentration of heavy metals, hormones. I'm talking about the complete depletion of oxygen in oceans. I mean, it's a shit show, and it's n-dimensional. It's all over the place, and each one reinforces the others. So it's, at some point, all we need is a little tipping point here or there, and you get cascade effects that run all over the place. I can go on, by the way. There's about 500 of these, each one of which tells the same story. It's big. The order of magnitude is at least 1,000 years, and probably on the order of 1,000,000 years. We're talking about the origin of humanity big, and maybe even bigger than that. So now the question is, how in God's name do we deal with that? Well, we probably haven't the slightest idea. And we're as human beings, we live 100 years, and most of that is like in a 30-year window, like where we're actually agentically acting out in the world. So we're not really wired to deal with things that are magnitudes larger than that. We aren't well designed to perceive things that are much bigger than us or much smaller than us in scale, space, or time. So then we have to ask ourselves, what might be? What kind of thing might we be part of or be in relationship with that is the kind of thing that deals in orders of magnitude that are even vaguely in the size that we're dealing with? And so the proposition is that perhaps it's something like culture. Maybe even something deeper than culture, like the generator function that gives rise to culture itself, like innovation in evolution, right? Something of that order. So when I say culture, what I mean is we create artifacts, institutions, stories, technologies that actuate our capacity, increase our capacity to think and to do in the world, and that change us. Right? So we create them, they create us, and together we co-evolve. Right? But they're artifacts that are produced by us through our intelligence, through our hands, and our capacity to do things in the world. Of this, one of the things that we do is we tell stories. And when we tell stories, we will often find that our stories are built around these mythopoetic archetypes. Now, there's two possible ways of grasping this notion of mythopoetic archetype. Well, three. One is to say that it's nonsense, but I'm going to ignore that one. The second, and is the most common, is to say, well, it's an artifact of culture, that cultures have been telling stories for a long time. And to the degree to which certain stories have been showing up over and over again, which means that they're in cultures that have been around, or they keep showing up in cultures, one of the two, they have a density to them. They have a perennialness to them. And so they're the kind of thing that you might want to consider counting on when things get squishy. So that's one way of taking a look at it. So if we're dealing with something that's in the order of magnitude of, say, 1,000 years, that by itself is enough. If we're going to be trying to search for what are the kinds of things that pass on through 1,000-year cycles, we're going to have to be looking for the deep mythopoetic locations in our stories, and by the way, in our bodies. So let's talk about our bodies, because the same thread works at a longer scale. Our bodies are narratives, in a sense, meaning that the kinds of things that have been showing up for now thousands of generations, the things that have been showing up that made us Homo sapiens sapiens, instincts that are wired into us at a very deep level, at a pre-cognitive level, are still mythopoetic in the deeper sense, meaning that they are the kinds of things that showed up because they continue to show up. Protect your young is a mythopoetic that is in the body, it is physical. Because obviously, any being that has young that are not fish, right? And being that has a small number of young that are relatively vulnerable and doesn't embody protect your young is quickly extinguished. Now, of course, we can be conscious of that and have it as a virtue, but our body naturally expresses it. And so that process is even deeper. So we can say, okay, well, what is that? What's happening there? Is there a story in that? Are there deep threads that are actually showing up that brings us to where we are? Now I can say, well, the mythopoetic stories are both. They're both narratives that have happened to keep showing up, and they are also wisdom that has been endeavoring to find the deepest threads that have been showing up in our bodies that are as deep as we can go, and to reify them into things that can be made available to consciousness so that we can refine them and do them well. That is the ground upon which you can build something that might endure.
Could you talk a bit about your personal background, your personal history, and how it relates to the models that you've constructed to understand the world over the last 20 years or so?
If you notice that what we're engaging in is a very interesting inquiry, because we're attempting to do sense making about sense making. And for me, what that ends up always doing is creating many different layers of awareness of what's happening. So even trying to figure out how to tell the story of how my personal history leads to the inquiry into sense making is, of course, making sense of my story. But broadly speaking, it shows up as I was born in 1971 in Texas, and my father was in the military, but we didn't move around too much. And my mom was college educated, went on to a career in psychology and education, and ultimately politics. And for me, if you know anything about the culture of Texas in the 70s, just assume that's, if you watch the movie Boyhood or Dazed and Confused, just assume that that's the context. And then layer on the fact that I sort of was participating in boy nerd culture in that time. So comic books, science fiction, fantasy, a really OCD level of pop culture, film and television, computers, and role-playing games. And again, pretty obsessively, like a lot. And so this impresses itself upon my psychology. Lots of different kinds of artifacts, things like not just the notion of, say, the way that a person who grew up playing chess thinks about life in the model or the framework of chess, but actually growing up playing every game and thinking about the meta structure that gives rise to games intuitively and how you can drop into any game and be able to derive what it is. If we sort of fast forward to college, this put me in a place where, for example, I didn't really have any particular notion of a major, because that's just a story. And it's not a story that worked for what I was trying to accomplish, so I just hacked that. It was nice that the concept of hacking had become somewhat meaningful in that time frame, and I had participated in hacker culture, so broadly applying the hacker ethos to whatever happened to be there. You're in relationship with a power structure that's stronger than you, but if you can use a combination of cleverness and elegance, you can figure out how to actually make it do the things you want to do and get away with it. This is kind of like the very Gen X temporary autonomous zone hacker cipher freak ethos. We can create a space for autonomy. And then when I graduated, moved out to California, had no idea, by the way, how the tech industry worked at all, like zero experience. And for example, didn't know that San Francisco was the place to go. I just knew that kind of west was a good directionality. And in San Diego, ended up getting involved in the high-tech scene, ended up being involved in the startup of 3 companies in a row pretty quickly, right at the froth stage of the .com boom, something called MP3. And then the third company was DivX, which I was the founder and CEO of, and rode that through the bubble popping and then all the way up to the financial crisis of 2008. But it was nice. Like, I actually got, on the one hand, to apply the underlying theory, refine the theory in practice, like really seeing firsthand how a lot of these things emerged and went through their arcs, like from inception all the way to maturity, through that pace, and ended up with enough resources that I could more or less do what I wanted to. So then I did. And I spent 2 glorious years doing exactly what I wanted to. And in the process of that, largely what I wanted to do was like spend time at a place called the Santa Fe Institute. And by the way, another place called Necker Island. So like 2 very different versions of what I want to. But continued, by the way, basically under the heading of getting a better sense of what's exactly going on. Like, all right, who are these rich people we've heard of? And who are the global elite that we've heard so much about? Well, why don't we just meet them and find out? So I did. And in the context of science, all right, where are the smartest people doing the most interesting work in the broadest way? Oh, they're here. Okay, cool, let's go spend time with them as well. But then the financial crisis hit, and I happened to be just sitting there at a place where I could ask questions. And so I started asking questions. And I was in this really interesting place where I was literally at a conference at SFI when I think like the Dow dropped 800 points, 900 points, and 1,000 points like day after day after day, which had the consequence of getting a lot of attention. And I was able to watch the story that was being told through MSNBC and through official channels I was able to ask the actual Nobel Prize winning economists who just happened to be like right there what's actually going on. And I was able to then witness the gap between the official story, what was really happening, and the fact that the economists had no fucking idea. Like even their underlying models were just whack. So I got interested, and so I started digging, and I just more or less followed my nose. I read all the books on money theory, for example, and David Graeber's book, by the way, is fantastic and blows a lot of concepts, particularly the legitimacy of the economic discipline, out of the water. And of course, I also read other things like complexity economics. But it doesn't stop there. Once you start getting into complexity, the first thing you learn is that everything's connected to everything else. So if you want to do economics, you also have to look at the interface between economics and politics. I think yesterday we talked about the 4-layer model that talks about the path you can, for example, model finance, economics, politics, and culture as being distinct layers that feed back on each other in a very complex fashion. But that if you have a financial crisis, you can actually allow that financial crisis to happen at the finance level. And while it will have impacts at the economic level, it may not necessarily have any meaningful impact at the political level. It may even strengthen the political level. Or you can do what we did, which was you can actually more or less bail out, well, both metaphorically and practically bail out the financial level by spending cultural currency, meaning breaking people's underlying trust at the political level, and then ultimately even at the cultural level, which is to say people's sense of being part of the same cultural fabric. Greece, for example, I think has had a lot of that. And of course, again, watching that in real time. So again, a place of being able to be front and center with the unfurling of reality. And by the way, having skin in the game. My large pile of money that I'd made by being a tech entrepreneur became a smaller pile of money as a result of the financial crisis. So I wasn't, what's the right term?
Disinterested.
I was not disinterested. I was quite interested and a bit pissed off, to be perfectly frank. And I got even more pissed off as I continued watching what was happening, because it was, to me at least now, increasingly obvious that the choices that were being made at the level of how our collective choice making worked, let's say, for example, at the level of politics, were bad, like actually bad, like they would have long-term negative consequences. And just kept on going deeper. And then I found myself in a situation where I had a series of significant oh shits, where I would have conversations with people who were really like the expert in some particular domain of interest, say, for example, nuclear proliferation, or the concentration of estrogen in amphibians, like very narrow, specific domains. And I had probably over a period of about a year, a series of conversations, each one of which was, things are really terrible. Like there's something going on that is way bad, like nuclear proliferation. The likelihood that we will be able to keep the world from having a quite significant bad nuclear event over the next decade is very low, like 5%. Like sitting there with like the 3 experts in the world on that question, and they're all nodding their heads saying, yeah, this is fucked. Like this is really a serious problem. And then it's taking literally one step back and noticing that fact does not seem to propagate out of that room. And then beginning to get my meta model relationship between culture and technology, now just plugging more in. The relationship between politics and technology, and between communications and politics, and between environmental and between the whole thing. And beginning to notice that I seem to be one of the very few people who was talking to all these different groups and trying to see how the chain fit together from beginning to end, top to bottom, and how everything's synthesized. And what happens when you start thinking about changes in rainfall and temperature impact on food with populations and politics. What impact does migration have on political stability? What impact does political stability have on financial stability? Like, watching the cascade effects. And somewhere around, I guess, 2012, came to the conclusion that the thing that we're operating in, whatever the container is that keeps the world held in a somewhat functioning system, is end of life. And there's theoretical ways to describe exactly what it is, exactly why, and exactly what we might be able to do about it, which, by the way, is very little. in the context of itself, right? So we've reached the end of life of a deep premise on how to go about being humans together in relationship to the world. And we're seeing this come to fruition everywhere. And by the way, I mean everywhere. I can even literally describe Hollywood blockbuster films in this model, and video games. So, okay, so then the next couple of years was, given that, let's get back to actuation. So in sense making, let's take what might we be able to do? And this gave rise to a project that became called Game B, which some people have heard about, which is actually kind of neat, because there were ultimately about 30 or 40 people who were involved in that project, and we weren't able to get to where it needed to get to in and of itself. So we dissolved the project in, I think, 2013 or so, maybe 2014. And the fact that the concepts have propagated out is actually a very interesting reality, but not vastly. And means that kind of gets us more or less where we are. In the Blue Church essay, I talked about it in the context of rowing a boat. So in the beginning, let's say you're trying to canoe. So you have one oar, and you have to have the effort of getting the physical motion of putting the oar in the water and pulling it and not tipping over the boat. And so that's a set of functions, a set of different kinds of perception and actuation capacities. You have to have some sensitivity to how your weight is affecting the weight of the boat and how your arms are moving the oar into the water. But as an individual, as a body which is coherent, it's a relatively straightforward thing to do. And you can notice this when you go from one oar to two. You go from a canoe to a rowboat. That once you add the second oar, it takes a little bit of time to figure out how to get them all together, but in not too long, you can become coherent. You can bring two oars into coherence. You can take the sensitive sensing of muscle to oar to feeling when they're in the water and pulling it in the motion of the boat, and you integrate it, and it pops. You have an insight, which is just that you bring into your body the wholeness of that, and you've integrated that into a coherent whole. And you can now actuate rowing the boat. But now you add another person into the boat, and notice that there's a significant difference there. That two people rowing a boat is a harder thing. That you have to use communication, and you have to actually practice substantially more. You have to get a sense, an embodied sense, and feeling, and say you're just rowing a canoe, because it's a little bit easier. The person in the front and the person in the back. You may even have official divisions of labor. The person in the back is steering while the person in the front is, just rowing. The person in the back is in charge. Like, there's a big bunch of stuff that has to happen that enables two people to come into coherence. And you may be able to scale that to, say, three people. But at a certain point, you actually start seeing a phase transition where, and particularly now switch it to rowing with two oars, so you've got three people in the boat. You really do have to start doing division of labor to maintain that. You have to actually have the guy in the front, I suppose, who's yelling stroke. Because otherwise, the ability of the individuals to stay coordinated, to stay perception linked to action in a fashion that is acting as an integrated whole, is not up to snuff. Like, we as humans haven't got the capacity to be able to maintain that much complexity with our embodied sensorium without trying to simplify the task. So we do. We simplify agency. We actually compress the agency and the perception and the actuation agency. So what happens is you now become an instrument. You no longer have full agency over your choice making or your perception. You don't decide when to stroke. You just do it when told. And if everybody now is acting in that actuation function, and the person up front is doing at least a mediocre job of keeping a good rhythm, suddenly you're now coherent again and able to go much, much faster. Hence the trireme, the big guy with the drums. That's my vision. I'm not British, so I don't have the Oxford notion. Okay, so that's a framework. Now, the reason why I want to roll out that framework is that this dynamic between complex coherence, your body integrated as a whole, and what I'm going to call complicated coherence, which is this relation of simplification and actuation through some kind of structure, is a big part of the rollout of what I've come to call Game A, which we might also call civilization. If you want to sort of start at 15, 20,000 years and up to 10 years from now, that story. And it's a story where, just like moving from one person to three people to seven people, and moving from one oar to two oars, is a story of an increase in the nature of the lived environment that our structures of sense-making and choice-making and actuation are endeavoring to be coherent in, and to therefore give us the capacity to operate in effectively as a group. The Blue Church emerged in the context of having to figure out how to navigate all of these changes and generate coherence. How do we get all of these people with these new capacities to be able to make sense of the world in some fashion that is able to then make choices together and to act effectively? Right? That's the question. And the Blue Church developed to be the answer to that question. Right? So it developed the ability to say, for example, use the education system to establish an embodied sense of vertical meritocratic hierarchy. Right? The idea that some people are better at others in knowing certain kinds of things. We can find them, and then we empower them to have hierarchical authority in the structure that we're in. And I should say this, by the way, both formally and informally. The role of being in class is teaching that. Whether the content of the story of the class, whatever the content of the class is, the experience of the student is the teacher's in charge. Our job is just to listen. And some of us are smart, and they get to be teachers or in charge, right? That's the story of school. And it's very important, that first part, that there's a relationship between authority and receptor that has a broadcast modality. So the Blue Church is very broadcast across its entire mode. So what I mean by broadcast, of course, is exemplified in television, which is to say that some small number of people get to speak, and a very, very large number of people get to listen. And so it's very different than say, what we're doing right here. It's symmetric. While, of course, I'm the one speaking, in principle, there's nothing about this conversation that couldn't be perfectly symmetric. But in television, in any kind of broadcast modality, it's structurally that way. So Walter Cronkite tells the news, and everybody else watches it. And there's a lot of passivity there. Like, my job is not to perceive what's going on, make sense of it, and then express it in the world. My job is to see the story that I'm being told and be able to then express that story effectively in the society that I'm in. And I call this good sense, the emergence of good sense. And you see an emerging mesh of good sense. Who are the authoritative speakers, whether they're NBC News or they're the New York Times? And there's a diversity, of course. There's a variety of different perspectives in the authoritative framework. The Blue Church recognizes the necessity of having eyes and ears, but it also recognizes the necessity of having coherence. So there's a diversity, but there's a diversity within a particular boundary. And so when you show up in society, if you are speaking good sense, if your expressions are of the sort that everybody else has broadly been hearing, or the authoritative statements, then you're showing up well. And if you aren't, then you're showing up poorly. And you'll notice that. Like, if you begin to say things that are contra-narrative in a deep way, even today, much less so now though than like 30 years ago, then you will notice a discomfort. People get uncomfortable viscerally, physically. And you will notice that discomfort viscerally, physically, and then you'll stop doing it. And so there's a nice policing mechanism that just at the cocktail party set, particularly in places like, say, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, where the elite cachet is the most important, where the choice of social success is the choice between being elevated in the hierarchy or not, then good sense becomes even more self-policing.
Good sense or good opinion?
Sorry, good opinion. Thank you. Good opinion. And it's actually interesting to make that distinction, because the effort of the Blue Church is actually to provide good sense. Right? What is the truth about the war in Vietnam? But of course, it can only produce is good opinion. What is our perspective? And then make sure that everybody more or less has that. Because then you can actually have choices. You can actually make choices together. If we all more or less agree that this is the nature of reality, and we more or less agree that these kinds of actions will lead to effective results, then we're rowing the boat to the coxswain's yell. We're pushing. We have a menu that has 6 buttons. Pick which button you'd like to push. You have choice, no question. But it's in a constraint. Right? It's within a boundary condition that works. And then what happens is when you push the button, it actuates a whole lot of stuff. We've all decided that we're going to have a war on poverty. So we turn the dial on the World War II era bureaucratic machinery that took us to the moon, that built the interstate highway system, and we said, okay, go out and point that engine at poverty. We're going to start building the welfare state. Go. Right? And that's what they did. And sometimes it worked. You pointed it at the moon and it got us to the moon. You pointed it at poverty and it didn't work. Right? It really created a mess. And that tells us a lot, by the way. So I guess kind of that's that. Like, that's the blue church. And there's an entrainment because this structure has Harvard is kind of at the top, and then you have the rest of the Ivy League and Oxford and Cambridge. I'm sad to say that the UK lost their position. The Victorian synthesis was a UK-centric. The blue church was a US-centric global sense-making system. And it was broadly global, of course, through the first 3 quarters. There was the Eastern Bloc that was doing their own thing. But starting in the late 80s, totally global. And for a little bit of time there, in fact, actually functionally global. That period from 88 to maybe 1999 was a period where the blue church was a true hegemon and was doing stuff.
What constitutes the blue church? You mentioned Harvard, but it'd be good just to sketch out.
Who's part of it? Who has hierarchy in the blue church? I think is the question you're asking. Who has authority? Harvard, Ivy League universities, some of the sort of bigger think tanks, the Rand Corporation, significant governmental entities like the Department of Defense, NASA, the CIA in different domains, large corporations, GM, GE, back in the day, when that was like when what's good for General Motors is good for America. It's a very blue church kind of concept. It shifted to the tech sector for a little bit. Microsoft and Apple and that kind of a thing had a little bit of cachet. Some of the media structures like the New York Times, the Washington Post, really called the paper of record. The more formal, authoritative broadcast television programs, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN for a while, like in the heyday. By the way, just to add, the Federal Reserve is a big one. The IMF is a big one, as part of the Blue Church. The Council on Foreign Relations is a big one. And by the way, these are just like real things. Like the CFR was something that was started in the 1930s. It's a bunch of smart people in New York thought, hey, if we get together, we can make things happen that are better than if we don't, and just kind of iterate on that. And that's kind of like the cocktail party set, but there's a feedback loop. Remember, I mentioned that I actually did some case studies. I actually went to places where fancy, rich people hung out, mostly Aspen and Necker, and other places like Hollywood. And what I noticed, at least my first person experience, was that there is absolutely for sure an elite conspiracy, which is just they all kind of hang out in the same place and like each other. But it has a characteristic. If 3-4 people, one of whom happens to be in charge of Deutsche Telekom, one of whom happens to be in charge of British Telecom, one of whom happens to be in charge of a global investment bank, one of whom happens to be a successful entrepreneur who just is looking for something to do, and they're hanging out at a dinner table in Aspen, and they just start shooting the shit. They don't have a lot to talk about because there's only certain things that they actually do, which is business and politics, but mostly business. So they start talking about business, and it turns out that there's an opportunity for Deutsche Telekom and British Telecom to sell their mobile divisions into a new company that the bank will fund and this guy will run. You'd be surprised how rapidly that gets surfaced and identified as a thing to do. Now, growing up in the Texas Hill Country, I wasn't having those kinds of conversations, and I think most people don't. So that's an example, right? That's an artifact that emerges out of the notion of the Blue Church, that once you have a vertical hierarchy, and then by definition you have a finite amount of time, you get clusters of these people who are hanging together. And then, by the way, a lot of that human complexity creeps back in. They start having clubs, cliques. They start caring about each other. And they also start getting a lot of groupthink. That good opinion starts to really solidify, and they become blind to what's not within that good opinion. There's very good reasons to believe that the Blue Church is done, meaning that it's in the senescence stage. And senescence has a characteristic where when you move into the senescence stage, you tend to go downhill pretty quickly. So I'm expecting to see the Blue Church sort of increasingly obviously failing, and increasingly obviously losing the habitual or unconscious or unspoken position of being authoritative and being just reality. Right? More and more people are going to be going, that's a thing. That's not the whole thing. It's a thing, and it's kind of doing something, and maybe parts of it are still good, but it's not the whole thing. And it seems to be increasingly fucked up. And in the meantime, looking around going, okay, now what? That's the key. Right now we're in a space. We're in that space between 1918 and 1945. We're in the space between 1077 BC and 800 BC, where there's a gap between a coherent collective intelligence, there's a coherent structure for being able to respond as a whole to what's happening, and a new one, not an old one, a new one, and they're fading. So we're witnessing that transition. We're in the middle of it. And a lot of the phenomena that we've been experiencing over the past, 15 years or so, are of that sort, starting around 2000-ish. Particularly accelerating. You can explain a lot of the things that happened that seemed very inexplicable, like Brexit and Trump, using this model.
Partly it's about novelty building up behind the Blue Church and then exploding because it had nowhere to go.
Well, it has to do with gaps in the Blue Church, so blind spots and actuation gaps. That's one side. So it can't do the things that it thinks it can do, and it doesn't perceive. There's lots of things it can't perceive, kind of willfully, actually. And then on the flip side, the rapid evolutionary development of capacity in what I'm calling the red religion, or the decentralized collective intelligence, just to make it very clear. It's not the red religion, just happens to be an instantiation of it, a way of solving the problem. So, there's a developmental curve. This idea of rate and state is pretty good here. So, Blue Church state of sense-making, choice-making, and actuation, high. Rate, down. It's getting less effective over time. Decentralized collective intelligence, state, low. Rate, high. Right? So there's going to be a crossover point. And what we see is, on occasion, we'll see a breakthrough where this new thing has reached a point of criticality where its capacities are now good enough to show up as actually effective in the visceral world vis-a-vis the fading legacy. And I think now it's actually becoming relatively commonplace to kind of see the struggle between Blue Church normative good opinion and new structures of sense-making and new structures of meaning-making and new structures of how those are beginning to try to cohere into actually sovereign collective intelligences that are able to do the whole thing. But we're a bit of the ways there, for sure. It'll take certainly single-digit years, and possibly double-digit years for the whole thing to come together to a point where it's transitioned formally. We're talking about a notion where broadcast is faced with a couple of different problems, and we're going to talk about it both from the outside and with those three domains. So, from one perspective, broadcast has limitations in its capacity to perceive and respond to reality. It's pretty obvious, right? If you think about it, what's happening is every layer of the hierarchy has to compress the information. If you were out in the field seeing what's going on with, say, the rainforest insects, and you're reporting it up to somebody who's at a think tank, who's reporting it up to a policymaker, who's reporting it up to a legislative decision maker, they're having to simplify a lot to go up the chain, right? So you're losing an enormous amount of information, which means that you can only do so much. It's kind of like if you imagine, remember those, like in the 80s, they had those glass spheres that if you touch them, lightning bolts would touch your fingers. So the sphere is the whole thing, and the broadcast modality is one of those lightning bolts. So it kind of like maneuvers around the sphere, but it can only handle that much, and that's not a lot. And that's just the nature of the structure. Right? Just a structure that has that kind of geometry to it can only perceive a certain fraction from the bottom to the top. And then, by the way, the same thing happens the other way down. The directives that are given from the top have to be, they have to be relatively simple, because as they go down, there's an expansion of scope, which adds basically noise, because the person down below has to add a whole bunch of specificity to what to be done, and as it gets handed down, you get more and more noise. And so this means at the top, the directives that come down have to be very broad and simple, and at the bottom, the divergence between what actually happens out in the world and what was intended in the top is actually quite large. And so you've got a lack of elegance and precision, and you get a compression going up. And so this means that it has certain capacities. It can actually get us to the moon. Turns out that's a domain that's well within the scope of what it can do. It cannot solve climate full stop, period. And there's a lot of other things it can't solve. So that's one boundary condition. The other boundary condition is this transition between broadcast and digital, which is happening. So the Blue Church gave us digital. Right? We moved from an analog world to a digital world during its period of being in charge. And when I say digital here, I want to say very specifically, what I mean is network, symmetric, decentralized. So the fact of it being digital is important. It's actually very, very important, but it's not the thing that I'm focusing on right here. I'm comparing broadcast to this network decentralized, not analog to digital, by the way. Both are true, but we're just going to focus at the network to broadcast piece. So what happens is that a network intelligence, a network system for sense making and choice making is different. Full stop. Let's just start there. It's just different. And it has different capacities. It has different ability to take information from the edge, process it, make choices, and disseminate actuation back out to the edge. And it's more available to solve all the problems that we're dealing with. It's a kind of collective intelligence topology that is fundamentally more available to being able to address complex systems problems. That's how our brain works, for example. But to use to kind of a developmental metaphor, if the Blue Church is a really, really sophisticated, developed, and mature, aging boxer, the new digital collective sense-making is a 4-year-old. All right? So he's got good genes. You can see he's going to be good when he gets strong, when he gets bigger. Maybe when he's 14, he'll be able to punch this guy out. But in the meantime, he's not a 4-year-old. But in the meantime, it's not really a match. If you look at it and say, hey, wait, in terms of lifting heavy weights, Blue Church is going to win. In terms of being able to answer a lot of questions, or at least appear to be able to answer a lot of questions, the Blue Church looks like it's quite robust. If you take a look at the emerging decentralized collective intelligence that's beginning to happen on the internet, it mostly looks like gaps. It mostly looks like it's doing stuff in the gaps that are being left behind by the Blue Church. It doesn't look like it can do anything holistic. And when it's endeavoring to do something holistic, like so the QAnon phenomenon, it looks insane. And it kind of is. And if you've ever seen an absolute newborn baby in its body, it's insane. You know, its limbs are flailing wildly, its head's rolling around, its eyes are rolling in its head, because it hasn't figured out how to wire itself up yet. That's what's happening in the network collective intelligence. So there's a gap, there's a transition.
We talk about discernment and how that's a key skill in decentralized media compared to broadcast media.
Oh, absolutely. So now the conversation, which I think is really nice, is turning to now what and how. So the answer now what is decentralized collective intelligence. Great. How? How do we do that? So I said first step is know that you don't know. Right? Know that most of your habits are Blue Church habits. In fact, most of your habits are even Game A habits, but let's just leave it at Blue Church right now. And certainly everything you've been formally taught and everything you've learned from formal institutions, and almost all those are going to be wrong. So you have to actually step into a pretty child's mind place. And as a rule of thumb, just go very slowly and don't try to come to action very quickly. You know, step by step. You have to learn, you have to stand before you walk, and you have to walk before you run. And this is very much developmental. So within that context, what are some of the core capacities that are part of our developmental stage for us to actually be able to move this decentralized collective intelligence forward? And one of the core capacities is discernment. And I will distinguish discernment from, say, judgment or good opinion. So, and here I'd like to actually invoke the distinction between thinking and simulated thinking. So let me just do that distinction really quickly and then come back to discernment. So if we remember that a lot of a way of thinking about the fundamental structure of Game A, and in this case, specifically the structure of the Blue Church, is computational in nature. there's a schema of information which is simply true. And your job is to simply learn it as a schema, like know the map, and to be able to repeat it back with fidelity. And if there are if-then statements, to be able to execute on identifying what is the if, what's the pattern that is present, and then execute on the then. So, if I say red, press the red button. Your job is to be able to know that I said red, and then to press the red button. That's a computational function, bureaucratic game A. And when I'm in that mode, there's a optimization for being able to do that, which is to be able to do so quickly and with fidelity. I want to become a really good computer. I want to be able to do pattern recognition against the patterns that are available very rapidly and never get it wrong. And then I want to be able to output the appropriate output very rapidly and with high fidelity. I don't know if you ever played the game where you did math challenges where a kid would stand up, the kid next to them would stand up, the teacher would show like 4 times 4, and whoever said the answer right got to move. I think it's called Around the World. That is this, precisely. Right? Your job is to know your math tables down pat, to be able to see 4 by 4 before the other kid has even figured out what the board says, you're saying 8. That is a simulated intelligence optimization function. And then this other side, thinking, from simulated thinking to thinking is a very different gig. Thinking is, well, it's so different I have to actually slow down to even begin to articulate it. For example, when you absolutely have no idea what's going on, thinking is helpful. In fact, it's necessary. It's what you do. You have to be able to perceive a lot. I perceive subtly and multimodally. You like to be able to use your eyes and ears and anything else you happen to have as much as possible. And you want it to be very available to novelty, which means that you don't want to close what you're perceiving on something that you think it is. You don't want to impose a structure from your framework on what is real. So if you're walking through the woods and you hear something in the bushes, if you imagine it's a horrible monster and you panic, you're engaging in simulated thinking. If instead you stop walking and you listen and look, and you don't have any preconceived notion of what it is, you know exactly what you know, which is that I heard something and no more. And you tune yourself to just become increasingly capable of perceiving reality as fully as possible. And then as that reality reveals itself in clarity, making use of that and nothing more. I have just seen a flash of orange. And I haven't seen a tiger. I just jumped to a conclusion there. I imposed sense-making on reality. I just saw a flash of orange. Okay. What else? Oh, it's up there. Oh, I also heard chirping. Oh, it's a toucan, right? You slow down and allow the perception to really settle in, and you allow your mind to even be quite open and fluid. You're in a flow state, right, to use that language. The closer you are to a flow state, and the more you are able to engage in insight, which is to say not be in the box, but actually be perceiving reality with a lot of fluidity to it. That's real thinking. Okay? And so discernment is the use of sensing in a very subtle way, like nuance and subtlety, and a broad net of sense, particularly with your whole instrument. Noticing, for example, that you actually do have a lot going on. You're not just eyes and ears. You're several billion years of biological evolution that had to fucking survive in the wilderness using whatever it had and didn't throw out the good stuff. Let's talk about this discipline, this concept of discernment in the context of decentralized collective intelligence. So in centralized broadcast, for example, collective intelligence, it is mostly judgment. I have to be able to measure good opinion. I have to be able to know hierarchical relationships. I have to be able to output the appropriate output within the very narrow boundaries of what I'm allowed. I have a certain amount of artfulness that I can actually apply to the equation, but it's mostly fitting it in the box and then popping it up to the right place. In decentralized collective intelligence, what ends up happening is there's a signal to noise dynamic as things move through nodes. So if you receive something from a node, from me, for example, I'm telling you, this is actually, here we are. I'm telling you something. I'm telling you something. If you listen to what I'm saying, and in yourself are able to find that part of what I am saying that feels true. Feels, right? Does not kick off emotions of greed or fight or flight or lust or whatever, but it feels. There's a quality to it. And you've built that quality to a level of capacity where you're like, I don't understand exactly what is being said here. And most of it seems like it's kind of weird or noisy or cringeworthy. But there's a thread here that feels very strong. I'm going to separate that out. And now I'm going to skillfully express it back out. What you actually have now is a positive feedback loop filtering system. If every node is doing that, and by the way, let's do recursion, if every node is primarily focused initially on building its discernment and skillfulness in doing this process, right, then what ends up happening is the network is fucking amazing at making sense of subtlety. Right? You can take the perception, these subtle, broad, implicit pattern recognizers that we're all so gifted with, and grab very vague and weird, not quite knowing what's going on thing, put it into the system, and after a couple of turns, it's actually reified to a very crisp clarity that can be shared. Right? So that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to accomplish, is that process. And you notice how much of a burden is placed on the individual now. It's not like the broadcast modality, where most of your agency is limited to a very narrow band, and you're really relying on the causal structure that you're embedded in to do almost all the work. In the decentralized collective intelligence, for it to actually work, almost all of the agency is actually on the individuals. You have to have really, really effective, responsible individuals. And by responsible, what I mean is they're able to respond to the environment in the way that I'm talking about. They are not reacting. They are not shifting to a causal domain. They're not saying what they're supposed to say or rejecting because they're supposed to reject. They're listening and refining and doing the work of collaboration. And think about collaboration, how collaboration works. You and I are collaborating on a song. If we're partners, we're really collaborating. I'm going to be like, oh man, I just had this crazy sense, and I like play a terrible sound. But you're listening very closely, right? And you're good at it. You're good at listening very closely. And you're like, oh, you know what? Is it like this? And you play it back. And what you play back is actually closer to what I'm feeling. I'm like, oh yes, more like that. More like that. And then I'm like, okay, and then this. But now I'm actually a little bit better at it because it's more clear in me, because what you did was you refined it and expressed it back to me in a way that I couldn't perceive myself. But once I saw it, pop, that's insight. You just gave me an insight collaboratively, collaborative insight. So now I take it and I output something back to you. And now you're like, oh yeah, I totally get it. And then you drop into it. And now, boop, we're now a collective intelligence. Coherence is now happening in the fluid collaboration between us, and the things that can be produced are vastly more than what either one of us could have done separately. Now, of course, this requires that you have developed a certain level of discernment. I've developed a certain level of discernment. We're in a relationship that allows us to actually use that. We can talk about what that means and what the requirements are. And then we've also built a certain level of skillfulness in expression, so that I'm not creating noise in expressing it. I'm actually making it more signal when I express it, more real, more true. I'm increasing the truth of the expression of the quality. So that's a pretty, I think, pretty concrete example that many people might be able to grasp. And the idea is that that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how to become real collaborators at scale. And we're getting better at it. We're actually learning it. Like, we're noticing, for example, that our most natural humanness has a lot of capability to separate bullshit from non-bullshit. Authenticity from artifice. And authenticity can at least feel true. It may not feel good. Artifice can do a really good job of feeling good, but authenticity can feel true, even when it's kind of a clusterfuck, right? Even when it's not done exquisitely, particularly when it's hard. If it feels really true and authentic, there's something in there that your basic, deep humanness is like, all right, I can work with that. All right, where do we go from here? And by the way, I'm interested. And by the way, if there's openness, hey, we're just figuring this out. I'm trying. What do you got? And you send it back to me symmetrically because we're available, and I listen, and I hear you. Then we've actually created a relationship that has that feeling of trust in the relationship, which then creates an open channel to do more of it. Now, of course, we're rate limited. We're limited by our discernment, so we're always going to have to be doing work on improving the quality of our discernment in all the modalities that happen to be happening. And we are rate limited by our capacity to express. We have to get better and better at being able to express with clarity, with elegance, and with, what I want to say is fidelity, meaning we don't want to put stuff in it that doesn't belong in it. Right? I want to say something that is also subtly manipulative. I just got to tell the truth. Pure truth, to the degree in which I can. I'm going to fuck it up, but at least I'm not fucking it up with stuff that doesn't need to be there at all. Right? So I'm just expressing it. And what happens about that is very good news. And it's an extremely powerful process. And the process of collaboration that's available now, because we're all connected to each other, is unprecedented. And that has the capacity to solve all the problems we're dealing with. That kind of a decentralized collective intelligence with high discerning individuals, with clearly expressing individuals who are non-egoically, meaning they are not adding subtly or intentionally their own shit into the signal, but are actually simply endeavoring to share what is authentically perceived by them to actually feel true, back out with quality, is incomprehensibly capable of making sense and, by the way, making choices and doing things. So much so that it's sort of absurd that we just don't go there. You want flying cars and going to the stars. This will get you there. It'll solve everything. The amount of bandwidth that's available inside that domain is enormous. The problem, of course, is that it's hard at an individual level, and it's countercurrent. Now, we've been trained for generations to do the exact opposite. We've been trained for many, 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 many generations to insert egoic content in between everything that we do. We've been trained for several generations to be simulating thinking, not thinking. And so we've got to relearn all that stuff. And we have to be doing it here first. Each individual has to be able to take the responsibility and then learn to trust their own discernment in relationship. If I'm in a relationship with you and you are in fact trying to manipulate me, I have to be in this really weird, widely vulnerable state of actually listening, but then noticing in myself that there's a feeling that's a little off, and then being able to respond to that as well. Ideally to call it out. Ideally there's a way for me to exquisitely invite you into a higher level of integrity in yourself and in relationship, but also perhaps sometimes just to be able to make it safe for myself and for others. So that's it. That's the practice. As far as I'm concerned, that is the thing that more or less everybody should be doing right now full time. And everybody who's good at it should be doing it more, it should show up. If you are good at it, other people should be noticing that you're good at it. And one of the things that they should be doing is sharing that fact, so that the collective intelligence begins the process of being able to point its attention away from, say, simulation and artifice and towards truth and towards capacity building and growth, as opposed to exploitation and plunder. And by definition, if you're tending to people who are helping you build capacity, you're building capacity. So these people are going to do better. So it's actually a good choice for everyone. It is a better choice for everyone to be endeavoring to play this new game. And the more people who are playing it better, the more obvious that is, because the more actual visceral capacity is showing up over here. And there's a rate equation that's exponential, by the way, that once it starts to hit, it starts to achieve criticality, escape velocity, and just blows past this old structure very rapidly. And so there we are, that metaphor of a 4-year-old, where this is, if you want to play basketball, you have an opportunity to draft LeBron James. He's 4. It'll take a while before he's able to actually take you to the NBA championship, but the opportunity exists to have him on your team right now. By the way, and Michael Jordan. They're all there. They're just on the playground. They're 4. They're not that good right now, but in a little while they're going to be amazing. And maybe even at 12, if you imagine 5 of the greatest NBA players of all time playing as 12-year-olds, might actually be a pretty freaking good team. So that's it. That's the story.